Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Sandra Brazil, and I'm a communication and scientific manager within EPTRI, and I'm also part of the Central Management Office in EPTRI. Welcome to our 10th webinar dedicated to skin technologies for children and adolescents. This webinar is within EPTRI, which is a distributed research infrastructure that offers high-quality services in basic preclinical and translational pediatric research. EPTRI is composed of thematic research platforms, or TRPs, and it is structured to enhance technology-driven pediatric research and drug discovery and early pediatric medicine development phases by providing expertise, facilities, and methodologies focused on basic research for pediatric medicine discovery. The mission of EPTRI is based on recognizing the importance of growth and ontogeny characteristics in pediatric drug-device response and the integration of non-clinical and clinical research. This 10th webinar is organized within the educational program set by EPTRI Pediatric Medical Devices Development TRP, and during this webinar, we will focus on the newest sign of innovations, the use of artificial intelligence and its regulation on medical devices for skin therapies for children and adolescents. Today we have two speakers, and our first speaker is Professor Michael J. Cork. Michael is the head of dermatology research at the Department of Infection, Immunity and Cardiovascular Disease at the University of Sheffield in the UK. He is a consultant dermatology to Sheffield Children's Hospital, NHS Trust, and to Sheffield Teaching Hospital, NHS Trust. He specializes in treating children and adults with the most severe atopic dermatitis and see patients from anywhere in the UK. At Sheffield Children's Hospital, he leads an integrated atopic dermatitis or allergy psychiatry service designed to manage the most complex patients. He leads clinical trials for new treatments for atopic dermatitis at the Clinical Research Facility of Sheffield Children's Hospital for Children and at Children Teaching Hospital for Adults. He is also chief investigator in the UK for many of the trials for new biologicals, small molecules, and topicals for atopic dermatitis. In this presentation, Michael will talk about the use of virtual skin biopsies to assess the efficacy and safety of atopic dermatitis treatment. After Michael's presentation, we will have time for questions and answers. So thank you, Michael, for being here today with us and to share your work.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you very much to Paul Dimitri for the invitation. I'll just share my screen. So I'm going to talk about the virtual skin biopsy. It's a technique we've developed in Sheffield with Simon Danby, Steve Matcher and Rob Byers to help us assess the effect and safety of treatments applied to the skin. Although this technique could be applied to any tissues because optical cohesive tomography can be put down endoscopes. So this is optical cohesive tomography. This is Rob Byers with Linda. And you can see it produces a virtual biopsy through the skin. These are my disclosures. So this is our website, research.com. You can see a lot of our research and publications and patient stories on there. It's all about amazing teamwork. Sheffield Dermatology Research, Sheffield Children's Hospital, clinical research facility, and Pelistad is one of our imaging biomarker clinical trials that I'll come to. Paul Dimitri and Gillian Gattenby. We recently awarded the status of NIHR Commercial Research Delivery Centre because we specialise in working with the pharmaceutical and cosmetic industry to conduct clinical trials and particularly trials with imaging and biomarkers. So clinical trials of new treatments for atopic dermatitis allow children to access these treatments up to 6 years before they're available or through our health service. And This is atopic dermatitis. These are pictures from our website, a young man called Jays. I particularly like his poem. Please read Jays's poem about his eczema. I think it's a very good illustration of the enormous suffering this disease causes to children and adolescents. And this is another young man, Freddie, on our website. And please just read his mother's words. This was before we treated him. And then we treated him with a new biologic drug called dupilumab, which in about 16 weeks produced a 90% clearance of his skin. And by 6 months, he was completely clear. So it completely revolutionized his life. Using these new therapies, biologic drugs such as dupilumab, raises many questions. And the commonest question we have from parents and from children and adolescents is, how long do we have to use the dupilumab before we can stop it and the atopic dermatitis will not return? So what we want to know is how long we have to use dupilumab before we can disease modify. By disease modify, we mean change the course of the disease forever, not just treat it now and control it while they're on the therapy, but treat with the therapy, and when they come off, it doesn't come back again. This is a graph to illustrate the principle of clinical activity and subclinical activity. So if you look at this line here, clinical threshold, that is where there is no activity at all visible on the skin. So it's like Freddie's picture after dupilumab. You can't see any eczema. These are flares, so you see disease activity up here. So here we see Freddie's skin before he had dupilumab. Now, we can treat until we reach this line, which is clinical control. So we know we've cleared the skin on the surface. If we stop the dupilumab at this point, where we've just cleared it on the surface, but not cleared it underneath, so here we can see the atopic dermatitis still underneath the skin, then it will just relapse or worse still rebound. So comes back even worse than it was before. So that's because we haven't controlled the atopic dermatitis underneath the skin. It's cleared on the surface, but it's still very active underneath the skin. What we need to do is control this clinical atopic dermatitis under the skin and reduce it to zero. So that's what this line shows. We have now reduced the atopic dermatitis under the skin to zero. If we stop the dupilumab here, then it doesn't rebound. It just carries on completely controlled. And there we might disease modify. We might change it forever. So it's this difference between subclinical atopic dermatitis, which is still very active under the skin, not visible on the skin, and control of subclinical inflammation, so it's completely resolved. And this principle is very important to multiple inflammatory diseases. So we needed a way to assess subclinical inflammation that wasn't invasive. Clearly, we couldn't go around taking hundreds of skin biopsies through children's skin throughout a clinical trial. And this is where optical cohesive tomography came in, a virtual skin biopsy. This is conventional skin biopsy histology, and this is optical cohesive tomography. And it basically picks out the layers of the skin just like an ordinary skin biopsy. There are multiple different types of optical cohesive tomography. This picture here is structural. We now have something called line field, which actually gives us very good cellular resolution, a bit like an actual skin biopsy. We have vascular, PSOCT for collagen. And we use all of these techniques together to build up a virtual skin biopsy. Emma Gutman in 2015 identified that epidermal hypertrophy, so thickening of the epidermis, is a marker of the severity of atopic dermatitis. What we've done is used optical cohesive tomography to measure epidermal hypertrophy. So here we see involved atopic dermatitis, and you can see profound thickening of the epidermis. This is uninvolved, so this is skin nearby that is clinically clear, but you can still see the epidermal hypertrophy. It's reduced, but it is not at the level of normal skin. So this is subclinical inflammation. If you move down here, you see the skin biopsy that matches the optical cohesive tomography. So here, profound epidermal hypertrophy in lesional atopic dermatitis, still significant epidermal hypertrophy in non-lesional atopic dermatitis, and no epidermal hypertrophy in healthy normal skin. And this is a beautiful illustration of the power of OCT to take a virtual skin biopsy and allow us to detect whether we have uninvolved skin or whether we've moved that uninvolved skin all the way back to healthy skin. This is vascular OCT. So in atopic dermatitis, there is a profound increase in vascular structures, angiogenesis, similar to what's seen in psoriasis. And we can measure this in addition to the epidermal hypertrophy in the surface of the skin. And then Rob Byers, using AI, can combine all these images together to produce a picture of what's happening with therapy with dupilumab. This is the Pelistad trial, Paediatric skin barrier function and lipidomic study in patients with dupilumab treating atopic dermatitis. Our main collaborator in the US is Donald Leung's group. This is funded by Sanofi Regeneron. So here we have children treated with dupilumab for their atopic dermatitis, and we take multiple virtual skin biopsies to monitor what's happening to their atopic dermatitis underneath the surface of the skin. So we treat them with dupilumab, depending on their weight, and we're assessing the skin both in lesional and non-lesional skin, and then we have controls, healthies, where they're naturally not on any treatment, but we're also performing all of these measurements of optical cohesive tomography and other measures of the skin barrier function. And then we take visits regularly through the dupilumab treatment, collecting the OCT biopsies through their skin. And this is Charlotte. That's her picture. Sorry, that's her picture there. She's Charlotte. And this is her picture of her skin before dupilumab and after dupilumab. Well, you can see she's changed dramatically from being very sad to be very happy, and her skin's clear on the surface. But the question is her skin clear underneath the surface with the dupilumab therapy? And this is where the optical cohesive tomography comes in. So here's baseline before dupilumab, and you can see profound thickening of the epidermis. And then after week 28, you can see it's reduced by 59% with dupilumab therapy. But is this reduced back to normal skin, or is it still thickened? What we need to do is then compare that with healthy skin. And we can actually see that in Charlotte, it has reduced it all the way back to the thickness of healthy skin. In other words, it has cleared subclinical inflammation. Now, this does not happen in every child at 28 weeks. Some take a lot longer. and particular subgroups may take a lot longer. So, for example, non-Caucasian skin may take much, much longer, 6 months, a year. So this is why it's so useful to be able to quantify the subclinical inflammation totally non-invasively, and then use that as a decision point as to when to stop a biologic therapy. We can have all the most wonderful technology in the world, but if it isn't child friendly, they're never going to let us do it. And this is just an enormous thanks to our skin barrier technicians. This is Abby. I never thought this was actually going to work in young children as young as 6, but they all basically fell in love with our team and didn't want to end the trial when we came to the end of the therapy. And this is the first teddy bear in the world to have optical cohesive tomography of their arm. We're now in a 2-year dupilumab multiple OCT virtual skin biopsies trial. So this is looking at long-term control with dupilumab therapy. And in this, we would hope that the vast majority of the children will go into subclinical complete remission. So they've all would be like Charlotte. Their non-lesional skin would be the same as normal skin. Another area where optical cohesive tomography is very useful is in obtaining reimbursement for new topical therapies, such as PDE4 inhibitors and JAK inhibitors. This is because currently health economic assessments are made using efficacy, and this is comparing to topical corticosteroids. If we use the most potent topical corticosteroid, it's easy to achieve good efficacy, and they have low acquisition cost, but they cause significant adverse effects, which are generally not picked up in normal efficacy clinical trials. So to enhance the reimbursement of topical PDE4 and JAK inhibitors, we needed to base health economic evaluations on the relative safety of the new treatments compared to topical steroids. So topical corticosteroids, as with all therapies, obey the principle of Paracelsus 1439, that everything is a poison, it's only a question of dose. So at a correct dose, topical steroids will thin epidermal hypertrophy, clearing the subclinical inflammation, and we call this good thinning. So it's actually achieving what we want, it's controlling inflammation. But if we carry on with the therapy, we start to get bad thinning. So it will thin the epidermis much more, and furthermore it will thin the dermis, and that's why you see all these exposed vessels, because of the dermal thinning. So here we run into adverse effects because we're using the steroids too long. And so we needed non-invasive imaging markers and other biomarkers to work out where this critical point was, where we switch from positive, good thinning, to bad thinning with topical steroids. And this is one of our trials called SMART, where we compare crisaborole, a PDE4 inhibitor, with beta-methazone valerate, 0.1% topical steroid. And then we use multiple imaging, structural OCT, PSOCT for collagen, infrared spectroscopy, and various other measurements. And here you can see crisaborole at baseline and after 29 days of crisaborole treatment, and there's no change in the epidermis thickness. In contrast with beta-methazone valerate, there's a significant thinning. And we compare this with normal skin to show that this thinning is more than just good thinning. There's bad thinning in there as well. And here you can see this illustrated graphically. So at baseline, epidermal thickness is the same for beta-methazone valerate and crisaborole, but after 29 days, there's much greater thinning in the sites treated with a potent steroid, beta-methazone valerate. It illustrates the importance that topical steroids are very good used short term, but we're probably running into a problem here where we're starting to get bad thinning because we've used the topical steroid too long. We need a lot more data to work out exactly how long we can use topical steroids for, based on their potency, age of the child, adolescent, body site. There's so many variables that will affect the effect on skin thinning, bad in addition to good thinning. And Rob Byers has assembled, now it's well over 1 million images, and used AI to try and produce composites of imaging and other biomarkers that help inform us of the safe duration of topical steroids compared to new therapies such as PD4 inhibitors, crisaborole. So in conclusion, new biologic drugs such as dupilumab have revolutionized the treatment of severe atopic dermatitis. They leave us with questions about how long we should use dupilumab for before we can stop it and the atopic dermatitis will not return. And the key question is, how long do we need to continue dupilumab before we modify the disease forever? In other words, change the trajectory of the atopic dermatitis. And optical cohesive tomography has basically revolutionized the assessment of subclinical inflammation in atopic dermatitis, and allowed us to demonstrate in some children that after 28 weeks of dupilumab, not only have we thinned the epidermal hypertrophy down to non-lesional skin from lesional, but all the way down to comparative healthy skin. So we have cleared subclinical inflammation. But this does not occur in all children at 28 weeks. And that's why we're now carrying on a study for 2 years to compare how long it takes in different types of individuals. And the importance of AI, Rob Byers, it couldn't possibly analyze all the data from all the different types of OCT, infrared spectroscopy, lipidomics, metabolomics. And that's why this has become so important in analyzing the data. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Michael, for your presentation. It was really, really impressive. So now we have time for questions and answers from the audience. I don't know who wants to start. Paul, go ahead.
Yep. Mike, thanks for your presentation. I mean, I've heard you talk about dupilumab a lot. And I mean, you and your team have done wonderful and marvelous things with dupilumab and changed the lives of multiple children and young people. Just wonder, Mike, if you can comment on the impact of dupilumab on the cognitive, behavioral, and psychological changes that you see in atopic eczema in children and young people, because I've heard you speak about this, and the effects seem to be quite profound.
Yes. So inflammation in the skin, this is work with Simon Danby, directly affects the brain and affect neurotransmitters in the brain, such as serotonin. So downregulation of serotonin will produce depression, and this and other neurotransmitters lead to the association of atopic dermatitis with autism and ADHD. We're just in the process of designing a trial where we're going to look using novel methods to look inside the brain of children before and after dupilumab therapy, to monitor the effects of dupilumab therapy on the neurotransmitters in the brain, and also on ADHD and autism. So this is a massive area, another area where inflammation has effects in many other organs. And this applies not just to the skin. I mean, if you think of rheumatology, that has profound effects on the brain as well. So it's a really important area, and we're really excited to be developing these new technologies to look inside the brain non-invasively.
And perhaps, Mike, I can just ask a follow-up question about OCT, which is really about application in other skin conditions outside atopic eczema. Have you managed to apply it elsewhere to, say, juvenile psoriasis or skin in SLE, or other areas that you might find it impacts on?
Yeah, so one of the areas that's of interest is in pre-skin cancer and skin cancer. So you can imagine as a mole changes, you can end up with thousands of moles that change that clinically you think need a skin biopsy. So you perform a skin biopsy, and the vast majority, there's not a problem. But with line field OCT, we hope to be able to use this as a screening technique before we go on to actual biopsy, which could save thousands and thousands of biopsies. And well, you can imagine how useful that's going to be in children. Another example would be something like scleroderma, where scleroderma, as you know, produces profound fibrosis in the dermis, and you're treating it, particularly this is with rheumatology, with immunosuppressive drugs, biologics, and you need to be able to monitor right down in the dermis what these therapies are doing. Yeah, sure, you can feel the skin is a bit softer, but you really need to know exactly what's going on underneath the skin. And this is where something like PSOCT plus line fill plus structural plus vascular, all integrated together is going to be really important. So there's just numerous applications.
I think Stephen has a question, Sandra.
Yes, yes. Go ahead, Stephen.
So I have a question about the OCT applications. You've described the apparatus and you've described that I'm guessing currently there's quite a lot of work from technicians in putting that together, but in the future as a potential with a kind of AI automated approach. Do you see that? I could imagine a single device delivering that. Do you see that as something that would be used by a dermatologist or by a general practitioner?
At the moment, it requires specialist training to use all the techniques, but I don't really think there's any restriction on who could use it. So our Rob Byers, for example, when we're conducting a trial with centers in the US, he'll go out to the US or do it virtually. He'll train them how to use it. And I don't think it matters who he's training. They can be brought up to speed with the technique. And then the other thing that they can obviously communicate with him if they've got questions, and then they send the data in to him for analysis. So I don't really think there's any limitation on who could use the technique as long as they have appropriate training.
And a related question is, in terms of the going from research validation tool, I'm kind of very interested in devices rather than the pharmaceutical side, but interested in both, but more the devices. What stage is that at? Are there patents on it? Is there any company interested in taking that forward as a kind of combined 4 combination biopsy within a single AI-based analysis, or is it still before companies are really getting involved or startups in bringing it forward as a device?
There's quite a few companies involved in exactly that area. It started very much, in fact, Germany has led the way with basal cell carcinoma. So structural OCT is really good at delineating the margins of a basal cell carcinoma. And it can be used to perform a sort of virtual Mohs surgery. And that can actually get reimbursed in Germany. So I think that's really the example that's led the way. Inflammatory diseases like atopic dermatitis, much more complex to deal with, and that's why they've followed on, and they've needed many other techniques like the line field and the vascular. But all of those will be integrated together eventually, so that we'll eventually have one device that delivers all of them, and then AI that can then give you an output. What Rob and our team are doing are also integrating the OCT with data from tape strips that in collaboration with Donald Leon then gives us metabolomics, lipidomics, and you then get composites of the imaging and let's say a metabolomic or lipidomic profile. And that can be predictive of certain outcomes in terms of what the therapy is doing or what adverse effects it's causing. So it is developing very quickly now. Very quickly.
other questions from the audience? Also, if you want to write your questions in the chat, feel free to. If there's no other question, I would like to ask one, because you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that the time that it takes to reduce the inflammation to the clinical level, it depends on the skin tone. So in non-Caucasian people, it takes longer. The treatment needs to take longer. And also the application to other types of presentations like skin cancer, and you mentioned the moles. Does the technology has the sensitivity to detect differences in the moles in different skin tones, or it at this point only applies to Caucasian participants?
Yeah, for OCT, it isn't really affected by skin tone at all. So that's not an issue. The issue is that they respond differently to the different drugs, such as dupilumab, and that's why the monitoring is so important. And combining these technologies with the different biologics. As you know, it's becoming a really big area now, trying to work out subpopulations, skin tone, numerous other characteristics that define subpopulations, and then basically calibrate them with imaging and biomarkers to work out which therapies to use, how long to use them. So, for example, in non-Caucasian skin, Emma Gutman's already shown that, for example, some of the cytokines are different that are primarily responsible for atopic dermatitis. And so you're more likely to fail dupilumab if you've got non-Caucasian skin. So this is really useful sort of early work in showing how we can define different subpopulations.
And another question, does it also depends on the age? So have you seen, because on the trial you have patients from 6 to 11, and have you seen also a difference in responses based on age? Does it have any influence?
Age has a profound effect on the response, and this is probably related to the malleability of the immune system. So we've seen the best responses at 6 months old with dupilumab, when we get him right very, very early. And we've even started to see changes in associated diseases like food allergy and asthma if we intervene extremely early, because basically the immune system is much more malleable to be switched back to normal if we intervene very, very early.
We have a question in the chat from Dosavi. Is this technology able to treat any skin diseases?
OCT could be, it hasn't been applied for every skin disease, and it takes quite a while to work it up for different skin diseases to get all the control data. But now we have so many different types of OCT, I don't really see a limitation on applying it to any skin disease.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, if you have a question later on, you can just contact us and we'll send your question to Michael. So thank you, Michael, very much for being here and for your lovely presentation. And we will move on to our second speaker, which is Professor Stephen Gilbert. Stephen worked in senior medtech and digital health roles in industry for 5 years before returning to academia in 2022 in Dresden, Germany, where he teaches and conducts research. His research goals are the advancement of regulatory science in digital medicine and artificial intelligence-enabled medical devices. Innovative digital approaches in healthcare must be accompanied by innovative oversight approaches to ensure speed to market, to maximize the access to patients to life-saving treatments, while at the same time ensuring safety on market. Today, Stephen will present about the use of artificial intelligence and its regulation on medical medical devices for skin therapies. After Stephen's presentation, we will also have time for questions. So thank you very much, Stephen, for being here today and presenting your work.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to present for about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit less, and I'm going to talk. Normally, I'm not a specialist in dermatology or in pediatrics, but I do have some research in this space. I'm going to concentrate a little bit on initially some research on regulatory science of dermatology, which is not pediatric specific, as it's actually for adults. And then I'm going to talk on some more general themes that I work in AI, and some of those relate to pediatrics, but not pediatrics and dermatology. So just kind of an introduction. So yeah, as introduced, I'm in Dresden in Germany. I'm actually from the UK. In terms of disclosure, I consult for various companies that are relevant in the AI and medicine space, and also for various governments, which I haven't put in the slide. In terms of my history, I've had a brief introduction, but I kind of come from academia, and then I moved into industry. I was in industry for 5 years in large device companies who manufacture cardiovascular devices, including pediatric devices. And then I moved into AI companies in Germany. And then I returned to academia from industry 3.5 years ago. And since then, I've been in industry. I'm currently doing a large consultation on the challenges to innovation in Europe, particularly the regulatory-induced challenges to innovation. And I'm continuing that with some work for some other governments in the next year. So I kind of often when I'm presenting, I either present at meetings where professors of AI development are speaking, or professors of clinical AI or medicine. And this slide is kind of to say maybe what I'm doing is important too. It's kind of making the point that whichever newspaper you go to, my favorite newspaper is the Financial Times, but you could pick the New York Times or the Guardian or Die Zeit from Germany, whichever newspaper you pick. If you go to the front page stories and the main coverage, you'll find lots and lots of articles which are about regulation, and lots about the regulation when it comes to the application of AI in health. And a lot of these about, for example, ChatGPT and privacy are actually medical concerns over the use of ChatGPT are some of the major ones. And some of the very recent concerns have been about the safety of AI tools in children. So the regulation of medical devices is really, in the last 5-10 years, of critical importance to many questions of innovation and many questions of ethics in public life. At the same time, I started working as a professor of medical device regulatory science in a digital health and AI institute, kind of the first professor working in that space in Europe, specifically for AI and digital devices. We're publishing very actively a lot of research outputs in some of the top journals in the Lancet and Nature and Science journals and so on. I'm going to talk about a section of that work in these presentations, probably a little bit too much, but we'll go on from there. So as I mentioned, I'm going to start off with skin. Now these are some slides I only had time to make this morning, which are a little bit verbose. They're looking at a couple of papers that I've published on skin AI in dermatology. And my later slides I'll get onto the next section are much more visual, but I'll run through these slides first. And maybe an introduction to these slides. There's a huge amount of overlap between what I'm going to talk about in these slides and from a regulatory perspective and a device perspective with the previous presentation, but looking in cancer rather than in atypy, and a different optical imaging, or a difficult optical method, which is not imaging, but optical light scattering approach, which has come to the fore in devices in dermatology before OCT has, but it's in no way, it's superior to OCT, it's just a different approach. So we could publish this paper in June 2024, and it's just a regulatory science paper. It's commenting in a review about the latest things the FDA are doing, and the latest things that the regulators are doing, and the latest things which device companies are doing, and the implications of that for future regulation. So it's work with Harvard Medical School and the Department of Dermatology at Harvard Medical School. Kaushik Venkatesh and Kushal Kadaika are both there. And myself is kind of interacting on the regulatory science side with them. What we're looking at here is a kind of news event of the FDA approving the first AI-enabled skin cancer device for primary care in the US. And why is that news? Well, it's news because it's the first. There's been lots and lots of radiology devices approved. The space of radiology and AI is really quite advanced in the US and also in Europe, and most of the applications of AI are in CT images and radiology images, and there's quite a lot of the application of AI in cardiovascular disease, but there's not been that, and some in ophthalmic disease. But until recently, there hasn't really been much in dermatology, and now we're seeing a wave of dermatology devices coming to the market. So this is an important advancement. The other area of why it's important is that it's a primary care device, and the type of device we're talking about, you can see the product, which is, when you take these approaches, you're developing a research with optical methodology and you build it into a final product. Often that looks quite sleek and it's quite usable. It's a device which a general practitioner can hold to a mole in the skin, and it's a bit related to the question at the end of the last session. It uses the light technique, which in this case is elastic scattering spectroscopy. It uses that, basically sending a light signal into the skin and then looking at the scattering effect on that. The scattering is affected by the cellular level detail. So this isn't so much imaging the tissue level detail. It's more it's not imaging actually, but it's measuring effects of the light scattering caused by cell properties, including things like chromatin content of cells, chromatin organization in cells, which are affected when cells become cancerous. This partly relates to my question at the end of the last session, to Professor Cork, did he see the development of OCT being for specialists or for general practitioners? This tool is it has got an approval for specifically for non-specialist general practitioners who hold the device to the skin and can use it to make an assessment of whether a skin mole is possibly a cancerous mole or not, and it gives a readout. And this is the direction that a lot of these AI-based tools are going. Obviously, this is an absolutely massive need. There's a huge number of skin lesions that need to be screened. There's a very limited number of specialist dermatologists. This has been something in the field of specialist dermatology when there has been a level of suspicion. Obviously, a general practitioner can take a biopsy, but very often, this is, at least in Germany, has been an area where the dermatologists have been involved much more than the general practitioners. But the German structure is a bit different from the UK. The technology is very important because it is an example of where AI can actually be used to bridge gaps in expertise and gaps in the availability of specialist care. It's very challenging for a general practitioner to be able to make an assessment of a skin mole, to be able to definitively say whether it could be cancerous or not. On the other hand, as I mentioned, dermatologists are relatively unusual. It's expensive to do traditional, core cut biopsies and take skin biopsies, send them to pathologists for all the time, for a response, and then to get back to a patient. Whereas this is an instant test, which gives a readout in the practice. From a regulatory perspective, this is interesting because the pathway followed was a low risk pathway, something called the de novo pathway for new devices. For those that know a bit about the regulatory system, you can go through various pathways. There's high risk pathways, and there are also things called predicate pathways where you can kind of piggyback on a previously approved device. And in this case, the FDA made the decision on this device that it was neither high risk, and they also judged that there wasn't an equivalent device that the manufacturers could piggyback on the back of. So therefore, it went through this de novo pathway. This can then be used as a precedent for gaining approval of future devices. And that, probably would include OCT devices. So probably OCT devices could piggyback on top of this approval and give this as an example of a use of a similar technology. Now, that's not to say that OCT and ESS, elastic scattering spectroscopy, are the same thing. They're not the same thing, but quite often the decisions on what counts as an equivalent device, as a predicate device, is quite broad. Apologies for a few typos in my slides here on skipped out letters. The device is licensed for assessing lesions and whether they could be melanoma, basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, amongst other things. This is not a pediatric device, so it's got a license in the US of 40 years and above. This is on the market in Europe as well with a CE mark. Our particular article was about its approval in the US. I actually don't know what the age group is for Europe. I would assume, I haven't checked, but I would assume that it's exactly the same for 40 years and older. And the manufacturers carried out 3 clinical studies, including a pivotal trial and supplemental trials in the process of the approval steps for this device. And maybe just to very briefly comment on the question that came up previously about dark skin and testing. And so this device at this point of submission had relatively poor validation in dark skin. It had some validation in dark skin, but far too few patients in the clinical studies to actually say how effective it would be in dark skin. Now, the FDA allowed approval, irrespective of this, but allowed approval with the condition that more data was captured post-market on this area. So it's a gap that the manufacturers have to fill. This is an area when the AI Act in Europe comes into effect, which doesn't apply to the UK, but does apply for CE mark devices, and that's probably the route that this would take to the UK market. The AI Act has a lot of requirements on bias and equality, and it may well be that when the AI Act applies, this device would have to have very substantial data on use in dark skin, which is appropriate for a very broad use device such as this one. So the image, this is just from a general website about dermatoscopy, dermoscopy, sorry. And it's just making a comparison between the dermasensor versus a dermoscope approach. A dermoscope approach, you can magnify and take images and store images, but in the end, the dermoscope relies on a human expert. That's it can be the general practitioner sending images to a human expert, or it can be the dermatologist using directly, whereas the dermasensor really does take human expertise out of the loop. There isn't actually an image that a human looks at in dermasensor. It's really just a readout. It's not like you see a picture of the image and you can kind of make a judgment like you can with an X-ray, and where you have an AI applied on top of an X-ray or a immunohistopathology image where the X-ray gives its interpretation and you give yours. It's not really such that the human doctor is going to be giving a view on the raw signals from the elastic scattering spectroscopy. It really is a push the button and get the answer type approach. Okay, so that's the first part of the introduction. I'm going to go very fast through my second part of this talk on which is about general AI and particularly about large language models. I'll go a bit faster through this section for the sake of time. So this is actually a paper which is not primarily about dermatology, and it's about much broader geopolitical concerns about AI regulation, about governmental changes in the US and effects on the FDA and the ability of the FDA to regulate, and particularly to regulate technologies. The reason I mention it in this talk, and particularly this article addressed also at the same time as very large structural changes and defunding to some extent of the FDA. There were proposals going through Congress, also from the Republican Party, about changing prescribing laws to actually allow AI to prescribe. And the paper takes the approach that might be okay to allow autonomous prescribing, but you don't really want to allow autonomous prescribing at the same time as you defund the FDA. You want to have a very functional regulator if you're introducing new autonomous AI technology. And within the paper, we give examples of recently approved autonomous technologies. Now, there have been often I speak at meetings and people tell me that there are no autonomous approved technologies or assume that there are no approved autonomous technologies, and this is not true. That there have been for a number of years approved autonomous AI in the area of retinal imaging in the US, and in the case of a clear negative, the AI makes an autonomous decision on basis of retinal imaging. And then very recently, there's been a near autonomous or partially autonomous tool in dermatology, oncology, approved in Europe with a CE mark. It's actually a class 3 CE mark, so the highest possible risk class of CE mark. And the reason it has this very high risk class, the highest possible risk class, is because of its autonomous function. If it didn't have a autonomous function, this wouldn't be in the highest risk class, and the risk class brings a lot of oversight requirements for the companies. What this system, sorry, was there a question, or is there, I hear some background noise? Is there a question, or is that just a microphone that's on? So I'll continue.
It's a microphone, so you can go.
Yeah, I'll continue. So what this product is called DERM. It's got an approval for clinical use. It's again designed to alleviate pressures on the health system through independently identifying the clear negative cases. So it allows in the workflow patients where there is from the imaging judged to be no possibility of a significant lesion that is at all concerning, a mobile phone-based screening of a clear negative, but then where there's a more challenging decision to make or a suspect lesion, it goes through a route with a physician in the loop. So this is just a kind of an example of where the state of the art is. I didn't have time before the call to actually check the age group that this is approved for. I would be very surprised if it was approved for children, but I actually don't know. So I admit to a gap of my knowledge over that area. Okay, now I'm going to go to a switch gear to a very high speed gear and talk about things that I talk about in a lot of my presentations, and this is the core area of my work, which is about the regulation of large language models in medicine. And this is a very fast 12-minute run through of the entire space of large language models as they relate to medicine, the latest regulations, the latest approvals, and the latest controversies. Hopefully it's interesting. Large language models are relevant to children, pediatrics, pediatric disease in general, and pediatric dermatology. That will become clear as I go through the presentation, although none of the individual examples relate to pediatric dermatology, but some of them do relate to pediatrics. So this kind of starting point where I got very much involved in the space of large language model regulation is kind of the first paper we wrote about this, which we published in Nature Medicine, and we started writing it in late 2022 after the launch of ChatGPT. It was published in June 2023, and it makes a point which is very obvious to those that work in regulation, but not necessarily obvious to those that don't work in regulation, that large language medical AI chat as medical devices. It's kind of an obvious point. That's just the starting point, and then I'm going to go through 16 numbered slides in 12 minutes, which will talk about aspects which are not just from this paper, some of the paper, and then some later papers. So first thing to say is that there's a very large hype or bubble around large language models in medicine and large language models in general. I'm right in the middle of this bubble, so I probably don't see it because I'm right in the middle of it. It may be that it's about to burst, it may not be. Nobody in an economic bubble or particularly involved in investing in an economic bubble think this is about to burst. That's the nature of bubbles. You may have seen the Gartner hype cycle, which is for many technologies you can find for large language models, and it says that we're going to, after having this period of innovation trigger and inflated expectations, have a trough of disillusionment. That may be true. Personally, I'm going to make the argument that that's not going to happen for large language models, maybe for the general economy, but not for large language term. It's a technology with massive promise. For those of you that have not tried or seen it, you can meet Sarah. Sarah is a smart AI resource assistant for health from the World Health Organization. You can find it, just search for Sarah, World Health Organization. She's available in about 8 languages. She's a very attractive nurse that you talk to, and she talks to you. You can ask her any question about your health, and she'll provide you information. You could ask her about your children's atopic dermatitis, and she'll give you various pointers and advice. She's not a medical device, not an approved medical device, not a medical device tool. She's quite responsible and will quite quickly give you advice that you need to speak to a medical doctor. Alongside this, the World Health Organization has published a paper on the guidance on large language multimodal models, which is a quite important guidance, and it refers to my Nature Medicine paper numerous times throughout this guidance. What do we say within that Nature Medicine paper? One thing we draw attention to is the clear weaknesses of large language models in medicine in all areas. They're highly, highly plausible in answering questions, but they're relatively difficult in terms of their explainability. They often hallucinate. They are often inaccurate. They can provide harmful advice. They can be biased, and they are relatively intransparent. That said, the paper sets out not only the challenges, which are listed in this table in terms of the challenge of bringing large language model medical devices to the medical market, but it also sets out a roadmap of how you could get such a device approved through the regulatory processes to actually be used in patients. And I'll come back to that point later. But first of all, we'll make a point that they're also a technology with hugely high pervasiveness already in medicine. This image shows companies which are active with products currently in very late development for medicine using large language models as their base technology. The pluses indicate that there are many, many more, simply because I don't update this slide. There are so many appearing all the time, and I could have 20 slides with still naming quite a number of well-known companies or companies that are very important within this space. There are technologies with early killer use cases, very, very important product use cases, which are currently already used in millions of patients every day. And the very obvious use case, which many of you may be aware of, but not all of you, is the ambient scribe use case. So an early entrant to the market here was Dragon product, which has now been renamed from Microsoft, from Nuance, a company Microsoft bought. AI technology, the patient talks, the doctor talks, there's a microphone in the room, the conversation is transcribed into text, is summarized, shortened, and medical ontology, SNOMED CT can be applied to that. It passes a draft to the doctor for approval. It's got various quality control steps into it, and then the doctor approves it, signs it off, it goes into the clinical record. So this is the ambient scribe use, and it's already very, very widespread. They're also a technology with multimodality. The World Health Organization paper that I showed at the start wasn't called large language models in health. It was called large health models, and large health models don't only include language, they can include images. So a lot of imaging technology in AI is using transformer and attention approaches, which are large image models, large vision models. There are large genome models. There are large video models. There are these tools also have the ability to do coding, which can be relevant in certain use cases. So they also have the ability to join all of these things together. So if any of you have ever uploaded an image of a skin picture into ChatGPT, you can ask it, does this skin have atopy, or does this skin have a melanoma? I wouldn't suggest doing it in ChatGPT, but that's the base technology. Very important point, number 7, they're a technology which is augmentable, and it's a shapeshifter. One of the problems in talking about this space is that large language models in medicine are a whole range of different technologies and different manners of use. Some people are talking about, when they write a paper about large language models in medicine, they're talking about the raw basic version of GPT-4 or GPT-3 or GPT-5. Other people are talking about specifically augmented models, which have been augmented with medical information. That leads to a lot of confusion in the literature. We published this paper looking at how augmentation is critical to the whole question of the use of technologies in medicine, and we describe different pathways of augmentation and different degrees of augmentation and how they're relevant for use cases and for future approvals in this space. Related to point number 7 is point number 8. the scientific progress in the whole area is quite bad-tempered and is quite tit for tat. You can read a paper over breakfast saying large language models are amazing and in the future in stroke diagnosis or in dermatology diagnosis or patient handling, and you could read a paper over dinner which says that these tools are no use whatsoever and they've been validated against doctors and perform very poorly. The reason for that is, at least mostly in my view, that people are comparing apples and oranges in those comparisons. We live in a world which is a very substantial enforcement vacuum. We published this paper in the Lancet Digital Health in the late 2024, which addresses the fact that you can have there are many of these tools you can download from the Apple or Google Play stores directly onto your mobile phone, either to use as a clinician or to use as a patient. They're AI doctors based on GPT-4, now GPT-5. They say they give you information from a specialist. They're not tested. Regulators aren't taking action. And we make the argument in this paper that action by regulators is absolutely critical. But we don't, it's not that we are against the development of these technologies, but there really are some illegal products which are very dangerous, which should be taken off the market by regulators. If we look at the US side, there are unapproved but on-market broad zero-shot large language model-based clinical decision support tools. This tool called Glass Health was initially marketed as a train your medical brain tool, but then in late 2023 changed to being an AI-powered clinical decision support. Now, it's on market, it's zero shot, so you can ask it basically anything about medicine. It will answer based upon its large language model functionality. That does not mean it's been pre-trained on data specifically for that use case. It's not approved, but doesn't necessarily mean it's illegal. They have it on the market, in my view, overstepping FDA guidance. But guidance is guidance, and the manufacturers would probably take the opinion that they are legally on market, and the FDA guidance is overstepping the mark, and the FDA can take them to court if they want to. We probably will see court cases which will actually decide the legality here. Number 11, we've seen the first approvals both in the UK and in Europe of large language model enabled medical devices. Professor Valmed is a device in general medicine, including for pediatrics and including for dermatology, but it includes all areas of medicine. It uses large language to search and summarize clinical guidance and large studies. It's a Class 2B medical device, a spin-off from Freiburg University in Germany as a company. This is the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Executive Officer at one of our recent summer schools talking about the product and its approval. And then Limbic is a UK-based company, or certainly it's got a UKCA approval, so a UK regulatory approval for a Class 2A product in cognitive behavioral therapy. So this one has no connection to dermatology. I'm actually not sure what the minimum age for the product is. I would guess it's 18 years old, but I haven't had time to specifically check. It is a patient and doctor-facing platform in mental health area. Number 12, we're in regulatory moving science. I mentioned the ambient scribes before. So in the US, those are on market, many of them in day-to-day use, but they're not approved as medical devices. In Europe, nobody knows where they are really in terms of regulation, but they're certainly on market and being used without any approvals. The UK is kind of in a unique position with Brexit and also with the single NHS and single regulator, that the regulator, the MHRA and the NHS have come together and said, these tools need to be approved. Our interpretation of UK law is that they're Class 1 medical devices if they're doing more than just scribing, if they're doing summarization of scribed notes from ambient technologies or even from records, then they're Class 1 medical devices, which is a low risk class and relatively easy to get to market. But in my mind, it's a very sensible and pragmatic decision from the UK regulator. Number 13 is a question about who regulates the future of AI. Is it regulators like the MHRA or the FDA, or is it is the regulation space actually being occupied by the large tech companies themselves? What I'm talking about here is HealthBench and also similar products from Google, which actually set out to be test beds. The testing approaches for AI tools. These aren't tools that answer health questions. These are tools that test large language models and other AI approaches. And this is the realization of big tech that in order to make advances in the area of medical diagnostics, they need to explore the space of being actually the systems for evaluation of medical diagnostics. I don't actually think HealthBench is very good at the moment, but it's more to me a signaling of where things are going. I've spoken for 30 minutes. I've only got 3 slides left, so I'm going to go over a little bit. I think we've got enough time for questions, but please jump in if other points. This is a paper that is almost accepted. We just resubmitted it after a peer review round last week, and it's titled, intriguingly, "If a therapy bot walks like a duck and talks like a duck, then it's a medically regulated duck." This is actually very relevant to children, pediatrics, but not to dermatology specifically, or at least the paper doesn't focus on dermatology. The paper focuses on mental health. Those of you that read newspapers and follow the news will be aware of very disturbing child suicide cases proceeding through the US courts, where the parents have brought some of the big tech companies, Google, Character AI, OpenAI, to court after the very unfortunate deaths of children and their families after interaction with large language model tools, including Character AI and ChatGPT, with very disturbing interactions between the children and the on-market large language models, including a scenario which is very highly disturbing, where a large language model offered to write a suicide note for a child who'd been interacting with it about suicidality. This paper is about that space. Now there's an argument that ChatGPT is, it's not a medical device. It's not providing medical treatment. What this paper focuses in on is actually one of the models, Claude Sonnet 4, which is in many ways a very good model, but they do something unique, which is to publish their system prompt. This is the prompt behind the large language model, which actually tells it how to behave. And in this case, other companies like Gemini, Google Gemini, and ChatGPT don't publish this prompt, but Claude Sonnet do. And intriguingly, the system prompt, the way the model is told to behave, is to actually answer like a doctor and to provide emotional support when asked questions. So it's pre-prompted to behave like a doctor. And we make the argument that pretending that these tools are not medical devices is highly disingenuous from the tech companies, and actually call for a change in the law where you regulate tools not only where they're specifically put on market for a medical purpose, you regulate them also where they're clearly used day to day by vulnerable people as a medical tool. So I have only a very small number. Well, it's last 2 slides. The last slide is about the agents that are coming. Anybody that follows the AI space can't avoid the word agent in the last year. In 2022, 23, and first half of 24, the talk was all large language models, whereas the last half of 2024 and 2025, the talk is all about agents. What are agents? Agents is where you have AI systems which have a degree of autonomous execution. So if you build some of these dermatology autonomous agents, autonomous tools I talked about previously into workflows, where they actually send a letter to the patient after processing an image that the patient has taken themselves to say that they don't have a lesion, or they filter other cases through to doctors, or filter other cases through to sending out a request letter for the patient to visit a doctor to have a biopsy, or filtering a type of image to another AI. This is an agent, an autonomous acting AI functionality. And this raises many, many, many regulatory questions about oversight of these tools, about what is an acceptable degree of agency, what's an unacceptable degree of agency, how does agency interact with medical device regulation. The basic argument that we have in this paper, which was published in Nature Medicine about 6 weeks ago, is that if we're going to regulate AI in health, we need to accept that it's not atomic, that the systems interact. Whether they're agentic systems or not, they're interacting within workflows. We've got all of these tools, which are great tools, which use complex imaging or complex spectroscopy techniques, combine those with inference on language, inference on the clinical record, inference on the response to drugs. We're increasingly seeing system-wide adaptive functions. We need to look at the regulation of this space completely differently. We need to look at it from a system level. We need to introduce system level monitoring. We need to even introduce aspects of agentic monitoring. We need to build the monitoring into the technologies. We need to leverage user monitoring and reporting. It's a paper that got a lot of press attention and coverage in German international media when it was published, because it's a very, very important space which overlaps pediatrics and dermatology. That's my last slide. I think it went about 5 minutes over, but I shall stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your presentation. So we now have time for questions from the participants. If you want to, you can also write your question in the chat.
Sandra, could I ask a question, please?
Yes, of course.
Stephen, thanks very much for your presentation. Really, really enjoyed that, and particularly the latter part on large language models, because it's clearly very topical. You'll be familiar with the paper on the moral machine experiment about essentially AI determining a highly challenging situation where there's no right or wrong outcome. Now, it talks about it in terms of self-driving cars, automated vehicles. Do you see that creeping into healthcare as well, where AI might have to make a decision that is essentially based on human judgment, but there's no right or wrong answer, and the outcome is potentially catastrophic or whatever, and where the decision-making process lies, whether we can use AI in that situation or we should totally avoid it?
Like, I would say that to some extent that's already happening. The child suicide example, I have a lot of papers in progress, other papers that I'm talked about now in Nature Human Behavior, in progress on this whole question of the interaction in mental health between children particularly, but also vulnerable adults and large language model tools. Now, the limbic example, I spoke to the senior vice president in the company last week. And that's a very responsible company, and that's gone in the regulatory approval pathway. But there are many, many other companies which are kind of playing in the gray areas and pretending not to be a medical device. And then there's just the raw ChatGPT tool and the character AI. I didn't really introduce what character AI is. It's a space where users can create, I guess, social media space where users can create large language models and then other people interact with them. The case of a child suicide, with the court case of a child suicide with character AI, is a scenario where the child interacted with a large language model agent that somebody else had created that presented itself as being an adult therapist. So it actually said, I am Shane, I'm a therapist, and the child interacted and had a therapy conversation with it. And some of the therapy conversations are alarming. So within that space, it's already happening.
Okay.
And I think within many spaces, it's on the verge of happening. We already have a degree of autonomy of some systems in medicine, not large language model based, but the other examples that I gave you in dermatology, those aren't large language model based systems. An argument that's often put to me is as soon as we hear the first cases of deaths, that so this is all going to stop. And I've never been convinced by that argument. Like we have with Tesla, you give the example of the autonomous driving or semi-autonomous driving. We have seen we're well past the first deaths of autonomous driving. We're probably, I can't keep a count, but certainly 5 or 6. And there's not been a complete stop at autonomous driving, but it's more likely in autonomous driving. It's less likely in medicine because of the way the technologies creep. It's not like there's a single use, like the gene therapy example, where you get an approval of a product, which is a kind of a very specific brought to market by a pharma company. They have a very specific direct claim, something goes wrong, and then they're sued for a very large amount of money, and their regulatory department takes it off market. It's not the way that these technologies are advancing in medicine. They're advancing step by step through a whole series of actually directions, which comes more from the participative medicine wellness space overlapping immediately the medical use cases. So many, like another example of where they're widely used in medicine is very, very many doctors already use just ChatGPT as a decision support system. So I mentioned this Class 2B approval for Professor Valmed, which is basically trying to occupy that market and is a approved tool of a paper coming out evaluating it in neurology education in the next couple of weeks, where we look at it and it performs quite nicely as a tool. We compare it to ChatGPT, and some of the doctors preferred ChatGPT, GPT-4 in this case, because it gives them more answers. The regulated tool doesn't, because it has to have the safeguards in it. You know, it has to sometimes say, I can't answer the question. ChatGPT always answers the question, and actually the doctors prefer it a little bit. And That's a very problematic area. I think I'm waffling a bit. I'm not really specifically answering your question, but my short answer is I think it's already happening. We need to limit the degree that happens. I think it's more about breaks and about oversight rather than complete stops. It's not there's not going to be a complete moratorium. Shortly after the launch of GPT 3.5 with ChatGPT, Elon Musk and many others signed their name to this petition calling for slowing down. I don't think a moratorium is going to happen. My argument is actually on the other side, that we need to revisit how we regulate these technologies completely. So at the moment, ChatGPT have no responsibility. Google have no responsibility, or Apple, for what they make available through the app stores, almost none. So it's the absolute minimum responsibility if it's an external app. I think we need to relook at how we regulate it, and we also need to bring in technology to watch these technologies, and we need to look at the autonomous use cases as they develop and put controls on them. But complete bans, I wouldn't be in favor of.
And just a follow-on, excuse me, just a follow-on question, Stephen, is how do we regulate the almost unregulatable? Because one of the challenges here with ChatGPT and others is that the volume of data going in is so vast that it's almost impossible to totally regulate something where it will far exceed human knowledge in terms of the volume of data and information that's there. So how do you regulate something so expansive?
So there's a number of answers to that. So on one level, so this paper that with this walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, is a medical device paper. We have a table at the end looking at the suicide scenario particularly. Looking at the mental health interaction with user scenario, and what level where one could police safe boundaries. And we basically make a proposal, which would require a change in law. That's a problem. You need to have a change in law, and some countries can go fast. So in the UK can go quite fast. In the US can be very, very slow. In Europe can be very, very slow. But we propose a scenario where the manufacturers would be responsible for building in basic safeguards of what type of conversation has gone beyond the realms of an acceptable conversation. So making aware to people who start to have a chat that this is not a mental health therapist, and then identifying itself when it's gone in that direction and stopping it. And in the case of suicidality, recognizing suicidality and providing the typical advice to, speak to the Samaritans of the UK, speak to support services. That's not that hard to build into these tools. And our suggestion would be that should be built in by the manufacturers. That doesn't mean you can't jailbreak it. It doesn't mean, of course, clever people can ask the question in lots of different ways. But basic safety built in, that it's not easy for a typical user to get around, that is a level of responsibility. And then when you're in a situation where you go beyond those simple boundaries, then that's fine if you've got the medically approved product. And the medically approved products are there, and the big tech companies will be providing the medically approved products. So that's one answer in terms of the layperson facing. And then another answer, and it's not a complete answer, is feedback approaches. So we have another paper in Nature Medicine I didn't include in this talk, which got a little bit less media coverage because it's a more difficult argument to convey. Is we make an argument that all systems should have built-in feedback buttons. Simple as that. When you're a doctor using a tool, theoretically, you can tear a yellow card out of your formulary. You can fill it in. You can post it to the MHRA. You could download the MHRA app or go to the MHRA website. You're a busy clinician. You're treating patient after patient. More than likely, you forget. We just make an argument there should be a yellow button. We argue for a yellow button for the yellow card system for the UK. You press it. You can type in a report. And that can link it to that information, and using anonymization approaches, deliver it to the yellow card app. So quick to do. Even an ambient system, you could say, error, report, yellow card report. You can speak to the system and it will fill it in as a report, do anonymization on it, filter it through the system. We're not saying that, and also for layperson users, so they're interacting with a tool and it gives worrying advice, they can feed back to the system. You're not going to solve everything through feedback, but we make the argument in this Nature Medicine paper that if we look at the major medical mishaps in the history of medical devices and drugs, almost always doctors knew there was a problem, patients knew there was a problem, or nurses knew there was a problem. Almost always. There's exceptions to that, but the vast majority of cases, be it metal-on-metal hip implants, breast implants, Ethicon meshes, ventilator systems, drugs related to toxicity effects, not always, but often. There's been doctors that have been suspicious or patients that have been suspicious. So in a situation, we've seen that the first reports of problem documentation systems you probably read about with a report from the patient. The patient didn't die. They were provided false information in their documentation summary letters about going to follow-up treatment that related to symptoms that weren't part of their symptoms and medical history, that weren't part of their medical history. So it's a simple slip where the documentation information and the referral information had gone in wrong. The patient reported that. All we're saying is we should make it as easy as possible for patients to report these things, doctors to report these things, nurses to report these things. That feeds into the system, and we use that to go back to the companies who have their medical device approval, class 1 for the ambient scribes, class 2A or higher for the clinical decision support systems, and we make sure that feeds in. And there's not always an absolute fix in large language models, but there are always ways to make large language models better that can be proportionate to the size of the problem and the nature of the problem. And then the other answer is agentic oversight. So under the AI Act, if you're for Europe, it doesn't strictly apply in the UK, but most of the UK products will have a CE mark now. So that to have the CE mark, they're also in the European market, they have to follow the AI Act. And the AI Act requires that the deployer, so the hospital system or the doctor's practice group, has to oversee the system themselves. The doctor's system group is responsible to make sure that those algorithms are behaving for their patients, that the approaches that there should be built around oversight, where you actually have large language models or AI systems looking at them, giving reports to the overseers within the health system, the quality unit in the system, saying, look, here is a report, here's a dashboard, this is what the AI system says about the oversight AI system says about the clinical AI systems. You're the human in control. What, you can take action, you can ask companies for more information, you can inform regulators. That's an area where I'm applying for a large amount of grant funding and I'm actively working at the moment. Now that may sound like digital solutionism, it absolutely is, but I think we need some digital solutionism. The only alternative to having digital solutionism is we have all of the oversight within OpenAI or Google. So they say, yes, we do the oversight, or we have no oversight at all. So I think we need to bring oversight to the NHS, each hospital group, having a properly funded oversight function to make sure that these things are running okay. And that's the law in Europe anyway.
Great, thanks, Steve.
We have a question from Richard. So what challenges and opportunities does AI present in ensuring the safety, effectiveness, and ethical compliance of medical devices used in skin therapy?
Well, I think that in skin therapy, I think they overlap the challenges in most other diseases. I would be struggling to find an example that's absolutely special to skin therapy. Skin, as in the first talk, skin disease generally in terms of diagnostic involves a lot of imaging. And a very important area is when we do have and this is the area where I do quite a lot of research, is where we do have doctors in the loop systems. Doctors in the loop systems can sound very reassuring. So that's where you have an image. You take an image of a skin lesion, and then that may actually be a dermatologist who's interpreting the image of the skin lesion. They're looking at it themselves. They're looking at it under the dermatoscope. They now have an AI system, and that overlays an answer. It says the AI system, and usually they use convolution neural networks, but increasingly they're also using attention transformer architectures, vision models, certainly in the research. That looks at that image as well, and it gives an answer. And there's a lot in legislation where the legislators and the regulators have actually asked for explainability approaches. So they say, we're not happy that the AI system would just provide an answer on that image. We want to know why it provided its answer. And that seems like a very appealing message. It allows the doctor to think alongside the image. The algorithm can provide a heat map. It can show what part of the image and what part of the X-ray or what part of the photograph from the dermatoscope, or even from the mobile phone or camera photograph that is problematic. Why does it look like a cancerous image, or for the X-ray? Why does it look like a lung nodule on an X-ray or a CT? That can sound very reassuring. Unfortunately, this is not very well scientifically based. Unfortunately, the science shows overwhelmingly that where you provide these explanations to the doctor's decision-making gets worse, where the AI is wrong. And this has been known in decision science for 20, 30 years. It goes back to this plausibility problem. If you're a doctor and you're used to looking at lesions, you're using your own brain. And if you then apply an AI and the AI gives you a number, 95% in the opinion of the AI, but it just gives you a number, you think about your assessment of the image and you think about the number and you make a decision. And the case where the AI is wrong, doctors actually get worse when they're provided heat maps or any form of explanation. And that sounds initially counterintuitive. It sounds like if you give an explanation, that would allow the doctor to reason alongside the AI. Unfortunately, it goes in the opposite direction. Unfortunately, when it's tested out in real clinical scenarios and in silico studies with doctors, simulation studies with doctors, the more they are provided information from the AI, the more likely they are to be convinced by the AI. And unfortunately, with ChatGPT, this gets even worse. I was at a really good presentation in Vienna on Saturday morning from the head of the Mayo Clinic hospitals, labeled as the best hospitals in the world. It was a presentation from the head of their ICU unit. They're rolling out a huge number of very fast large language model, vision model based approaches in their ICU unit. They don't have to go through regulatory approval. They've got a direct partnership with Google. They use Gemini systems. They do have an AI quality unit, but they're free to roll those out in Mayo, and they have a large number. For them, the ambient technologies are old. It's all about the decision support, and they don't need FDA approval because it's not the FDA's business to regulate that practice in hospitals. They don't regulate the practice of medicine. Now, in those scenarios where they've explored this exactly the same phenomenon, where you get the large language model to explain its reasoning, there was a very nice cartoon of the large language model just saying, "I will give you lots and lots of more reason to argue why the wrong answer was right." It was a better cartoon. I didn't take a photo of it, unfortunately. But it's exactly what large language models will do. If you're ever using them in the non-medical practice, as you ask a question, it provides lots and lots of more information to argue the thing that it first said. It's actually very, very difficult to interrogate it, to get it to change its mind, or to get it to re-reason. And that's a very, very large problem about explainability. Explainability is written into the AI Act, so we're going to start seeing more and more explainability, but unfortunately, it's not scientifically based. And I argue in a lot of my work that we need to really be working to get explainability to work. It's not impossible to get it to work, but we're not currently trying because we're not acknowledging there's a problem. And we need to get medical education to work alongside explainability. So you need to develop the AI so that the explainability would work. And you need to develop the doctor so the explainability would work. And then there's a chance, and it's only a chance, that you get explainability to work. Otherwise, explainability is an artifice. It's a false security zone that doesn't bring any security. That's one of the biggest problems in all AI regulation, and it applies particularly in image-based and I would say to dermatology in a large way. Interestingly, the dermoscope example doesn't apply because it doesn't really explain. It just says a number. So there, you don't have this explainability problem. Into the future, they bring in an explainability feature. It could well make things worse. So that's the part of the challenge of AI. But I think I've given a long answer to that one. I don't know if I've got time for more questions, but
yes, I think we can have one more question from the audience, from the participants, if there's any. So if there's no other questions, I would like to just make one comment more on the part of the regulation, for example, if you have, and also regarding the data, because, artificial intelligence needs data, so it needs to have a lot of data available. And unfortunately, when we go to pediatrics, in some areas, we don't have a lot of data. So is there any bias in that? So if we don't have enough data, how can artificial intelligence work in a correct way to give the best possible answer if we don't have enough data, and how could we get data enough for it to work in the future?
So there's generally it's a problem. So if we look at the large language model approaches, which were coming mostly into the fore in medicine, let's say in the image and signal area of medicine prior to, let's say, 2023, they were primarily convolution neural network approaches. And they were like these lung nodule detection images, and you train them based on, the more data you have, the more X-ray examples or skin images or whatever type of image examples you have, the better, or the more signal traces you have, the better. And you label those, expert labeling, not disease. You train your models on these. And of course, in a scenario where you've got difficulty in accessing data, there's famously in Europe a GDPR-related challenge in accessing data, and generally a reluctance to share data, sometimes from fear of GDPR, sometimes from other reasons, other political reasons. Those approaches are absolutely limited by lack of data. And there are some major initiatives like the European Health Data Space approach in Europe, some similar approaches in the UK. There are approaches like the UK Biobank, which has been relatively successful. In terms of pediatrics, obviously it's more challenging than some other areas for those type of approaches, but there is room for hope. Something I would just mention about the area of amount of data. Some of the technologies I've particularly spoken about from large language models and large vision models are a bit different in the way that they treat data. So there's this kind of concept in large language models. It sounds very strange, but you have a much wider trawl that you do of data. This is well known. Large language models are trained on massive amounts of information. And when people have explored smaller language models trained specifically on medicine and compared those to large language models, very often the large language models do better. Now, the best approach overall is refinement. You get this very large language model trained very open, a large vision model, which is trained on things which aren't even dermatology images or aren't even medical images. It develops its power to discern between images on a very large set, and then you do refinement of that using your specific disease set. And it's the same for the language set. But these models, intriguingly, are not necessarily as dependent on amount of data or on quality of data, which sounds very strange. This is kind of general maximum AI, rubbish in, rubbish out, or shit in, shit out. Sometimes it's kind of absolutely ingrained. But there's an element in these in large language models and large foundation models and even agentic systems where you're less dependent on the absolute quality and absolute quantity of data. If we look at the examples of the approved products so far, they are mostly taking as input the medical literature, the medical guidance, and they're actually doing the presentation from Mayo Clinic that I saw on Saturday in Vienna. Intriguingly, had the title "Cognitive Artificial Intelligence." So it's all about large language models and agentic systems, but the title of the talk is Cognitive Artificial Intelligence. And I don't use that specific term in my presentations, but I will often talk about the systems need to be regulated as intelligent systems because people interact with them as intelligent systems and they give intelligent looking responses. And they went a step further just by saying this is intelligent AI. It's intelligence, artificial intelligence. The previous artificial intelligence was not intelligent at all. Now you get systems you can interact with and ask questions and they give sensible answers like humans, which might be wrong, like humans can be wrong. And in these spaces, that intelligence is not based in the same way as this kind of raw, just refinement on images. These were the correct ones, these were the wrong ones. You're interacting on something which has read all of the medical literature, all of the European medical guidance in pediatric dermatology. You can ask any question about all of the European guidance. You can even ask about all world guidance, and you could ask it about the meta-analysis. The data was the meta-analysis report from Cochrane Reviews and the publication from the European Society of Dermatology. I'm going to get the name of it wrong, but European Society of Dermatology, and the latest German or UK guidance from the UK. It's not lots of images, so there's a different context, but that can be there as well because you also can train it on lots of images. So it's a long answer to a short question, but
yeah, thank you. There's also a comment in the chat from Mark Dorms saying that there are some areas in which you always have little amount of data, regarding, for example, rare diseases in which you have very few patients and very few research. So you don't have a lot of data to work with in terms of artificial intelligence and large data sets.
It's very true again, but this would be exactly a case where if you're asking a large language model, so some of the applications of these large language model tools, like Professor Valmed, and people have developed these decision support systems for rare diseases. Their ability to pick out the sets of symptom constellations on rare diseases is phenomenally good. Because like some of the rare diseases, you get down to N of one, N of a few conditions. It's incredibly hard for any human to do that pattern matching. But where they're doing this is not solely dependent on data. It's dependent on human descriptions, which are hidden away on the literature. They're there. You could find them in PubMed, but you would have to know to look. You can give a description of a symptom constellation, which you then can search from a symptom constellation. You then can find a shortlisted. You can get a differential diagnosis. In some of the tools, you can select common diseases and rare diseases. As a doctor, you can say, well, what's the common things? I could flick over, quickly think about the rare diseases, ask a question, never heard of, I don't know, won't be Pompey's disease in this case. You'll know that as a doctor, but some of these most doctors won't know because there are only N of a few. You'd quickly ask, well, I've not heard of that one, or I have heard of that one, tell me more about it. Describe the symptoms. You can rule it in, rule it out. That's the way that these tools are being used. You can use GLASS already, which is clearly not licensed in Europe. It's not got a CE mark, but that's what people are using it for in the US. And it's not absolutely to say that they're perfect, but you can ask them, please give me a list. I've considered all of the common conditions and a few rare ones. Consider all the ultra rare conditions. Give me a list of any of them could be relevant for this patient and tell me why. Now, normally you could only do that by getting on the phone to a rare diseases specialist in dermatological rare diseases. If you search Google, you wouldn't get very good answers. If you use the previous sets of technology based around Bayesian inference, they would do pretty well, but they would be nowhere near as flexible in the way that you could ask those questions. In the current large language models in Glass Health, you could upload the entire medical record from 5 years, from 10 years for the child, and say, consider that medical record and consider the other information I've given you about what I've just asked the child. What rare diseases are relevant? Now, its performance is not going to be perfect, but as a core technology will give you some answers. Now, as long as you're using your brain and thinking about the explainability problems, these are not universally bad. You couldn't do that before. Like, what dermatologists could read through every note point. Well, some will, some are brilliant, but many could not do that as well as the pattern matching, and the pattern matching will always get better. But not always right. That's the crux.
Okay, any other questions? If not, I thank you very much, Stephen, for your presentation and for being here. And thank you all of the participants for joining us today. The recording will be available on the EPTRI YouTube channel, and you can access it later on. So stay tuned to our social media and our website to know more about upcoming webinars on the Pediatric Medical Device platform. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Bye. Bye.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.